Few events carry such symbolic potency as Pentecost, shrouded in a mist of superficial interpretations and reduced over the centuries to a literal narrative that barely conveys its true nature. The scene described in the Acts of the Apostles, with tongues of fire hovering over the disciples and crowds understanding messages in languages they never studied, is more than a miraculous manifestation. It's a spiritual code, a hidden archetype, a call to inner awakening. What unfolds there is not just the foundation of a church, as commonly said, but the inauguration of a new perception of reality, the birth of a higher consciousness among human beings, which begins with a fire that doesn't burn, but transforms. This fire is not physical. It doesn't consume wood, nor does it warm the skin, but it sets the mind and heart ablaze. It is the eternal symbol of the Spirit in action, of the divine presence pouring out onto humanity not as an imposition, but as an activation. In the biblical account, this moment occurs 50 days after Easter, a number that is not arbitrary. In the Hebrew tradition, 50 represents the complete cycle, the return to the point of origin at a new level of understanding. It is the same number associated with the Jubilee, when debts were forgiven and freedom was restored. Therefore, Pentecost does not just mark an isolated episode, but the dawn of a new era where man is invited to live guided by the Spirit, free from the dogmas and fears that tie him to the material world. The tongues of fire that rest upon the apostles are described in an enigmatic way, but they reveal a reality that goes beyond metaphor. The language here refers to the ability to communicate directly with the essence of the other, surpassing the limitations of human languages. This is not about speaking in disjointed syllables or unexplainable phenomena, but about a deep resonance with the Spirit that each spoken word directly echoes in the listener's soul, regardless of their culture or belief. This is the true gift of tongues, to touch the universal heart that dwells in all beings, to activate forgotten memories, and to bring to light dormant truths. Christ had promised this outpouring of the Spirit before his ascension, and he did so with words that clearly indicated it was not an external event. He said, "The Comforter will come and remind you of everything I told you." Pentecost, then, is not the beginning of something new, but the conscious return to what has always been within us. It is the sudden remembrance of a wisdom that transcends the Scriptures, because it predates them. It is the reunion with the primordial fire that drives creation and that now manifests in each disciple as an awakened channel, capable of expressing the Word in its purity. To understand what really happened at Pentecost, it is necessary to step away from the literal narrative and dive into the symbolic language of the soul. Each element described, strong wind, fire, languages, is a key to accessing inner dimensions. The mighty wind that fills the house where they were gathered symbolizes the vital breath, the prana, the divine breath that animates all things. The tongues of fire refer to the illumination of spiritual energy centers, as if each disciple had there awakened their inner temple, becoming a living expression of the Christ that dwelled within them. The language that is now understood by all symbolizes the return to lost unity, to the language of origin, where there was no separation between thought and expression, between sender and receiver. The beauty of Pentecost lies precisely in this revelation. The Holy Spirit does not descend from outside in, but emerges from within out. It is awakened by the individual's willingness to become a channel of truth, to silence the voices of the mind, to hear the frequency of the soul. The setting of this event is not random. Everyone was gathered in the same place, in prayer and waiting. This unity, this focus, is a condition for spiritual manifestation. When the collective aligns in sincere search, the spark is inevitable. This teaches us that individual awakening is deeply connected to collective awakening. The fire ignites in one to then set the others ablaze, until all of humanity burns in consciousness. The 12 disciples present at Pentecost represent more than historical figures. Each one of them symbolizes an aspect of the human being. Peter, for example, symbolizes faith, John, love, James, courage, and so on. When the Spirit manifests on each one, it's as if all these internal qualities are activated simultaneously. The fire of Pentecost, then, does not awaken speech alone, but the entirety of the being. It integrates reason and emotion, action and contemplation, faith and wisdom, leading the individual to a state of wholeness that enables them to live not as a fragment, but as a reflection of the divine. The choice of Jerusalem as the setting for this event is also symbolic. Jerusalem, a holy city, is the spiritual heart of Jewish tradition. It represents, on an internal level, the center of consciousness, the point where all energies converge. The fact that the Spirit manifested itself there is a metaphor for the awakening of the human being's center, the point where the soul and the spirit meet. It is a call to internal ascension, to the elevation of perception that allows one to see beyond appearances and touch the invisible reality to the eyes. Another key element of Pentecost is the diversity of people who understand the message. This reveals the universality of Christ's teaching. It doesn't matter the origin, culture, or language. When the Spirit speaks, everyone understands. This undoes the inner Tower of Babel, where thoughts are divided and desires conflict. Pentecost is the antidote to separation. It unifies, not by persuasion, but by vibration. It is the voice of the heart that, when expressed, finds an echo in all other hearts, for it resonates with the eternal truth that is beyond beliefs. Many wait for celestial signs, for grand phenomena, but ignore that the greatest miracle is the silent transformation of consciousness. Pentecost is this miracle. It is not a flame visible to the physical eyes, but a light that ignites within and alters the way one sees the world. When the Spirit touches someone, their language changes, their presence changes, their life becomes a testimony of the invisible. This is the true sign that the fire has been lit. Life becomes an extension of the teaching. Existence becomes a message. The secret of Pentecost, therefore, lies in listening. Before the fire, there was silence. Before the speech, there was waiting. And in this empty space, in this humble surrender, the Spirit found a dwelling. This is the veiled invitation of this narrative. Not to seek outside what can only be activated within. The Spirit is ready. The fire is latent. The language is within us. All that is missing is the withdrawal, the intention, the surrender. When a human being aligns with this disposition, Pentecost repeats itself, not as a religious event, but as a living and transformative experience. And so, Pentecost ceases to be a distant memory and becomes a present possibility. It invites us to move beyond the superficial and dive into the essence, to abandon the literal and embrace the symbolic, to cease the noise and listen to the voice of the Spirit which, even without words, speaks with absolute clarity. The fire that descended upon the disciples still burns, but now awaits a new temple to inhabit, the temple of our awakened self, ready to become a channel of a love that transcends time. Throughout the centuries, the image of fire descending from the sky and resting upon the disciples has been treated as an extraordinary phenomenon, something that defies natural laws and that only the chosen could experience. However, this shallow understanding obscures the real meaning of this symbolic flame. The fire described at Pentecost does not have a physical nature. It does not operate according to the laws of the tangible world. It is, in fact, the visible manifestation of a spiritual energy that has always been present, but only reveals itself when consciousness is prepared. It is an archetypal ancestral fire, present in practically all spiritual traditions, always as a sign of purification, revelation, and inner illumination. And to understand it in depth, it is necessary to untie the knots of literal thinking that have limited the spiritual understanding of millions throughout history. In the Hebrew tradition, fire is a symbol of divine presence. In the episode of the burning bush, for example, Moses sees a flame that consumes without destroying, that burns but does not reduce to ash. It is this same nature of spiritual fire that appears at Pentecost. It does not consume matter, but transmutes substance. It does not destroy, but reveals what was previously hidden. The fire, in this context, is the energy of expanding consciousness, of truth that emerges after the veil of ignorance is dissolved. When the disciples receive the Spirit, it is this energy that touches them. They are not being graced with an external phenomenon, but with the activation of something that already existed within them. something that Christ, during his journey, had carefully prepared to be awakened at that exact moment. The association between the spirit and fire dates back to ancient cultures that saw in the flame a representation of the divine. In Hinduism, for example, Agni is the god of fire, the mediator between humans and the gods, the bearer of offerings that ascend to heaven. In Zoroastrianism, the sacred fire is kept alive on altars as a symbol of the constant divine presence. Among the ancient Egyptians, the flame was associated with the Eye of Ra, the solar fire that illuminates and protects. These traditions did not see fire merely as an element of nature, but as a channel for spiritual transformation. Pentecost, therefore, dialogues with a wisdom much broader than the isolated Christian tradition. It is the echo of universal knowledge, the confirmation that the spiritual fire does not belong to one religion, but to the human spirit in search of enlightenment. When the texts speak of tongues as a fire, they point to a light that manifests in a visible form, not on the material plane, but on the subtle plane. This light can be perceived by those who are in expanded states of consciousness, by those who have had the veils of the ego temporarily lifted. In esoteric terminology, this flame is often associated with the awakening of the body of light, the moment when the energy centers, known as chakras, begin to vibrate at their highest frequency. The top of the head, the seventh energy center, is traditionally described as a 1,000-petaled lotus or a radiant crown. It is there that the spiritual fire is ignited, illuminating all other layers of the being and generating what we call enlightenment. This process does not occur arbitrarily. Just as the disciples went through a path of coexistence, learning, and purification alongside Christ before receiving the Spirit, so too must we undergo an internal journey of transmutation. The fire does not descend upon fragile structures. It manifests when the inner house is prepared, when the temple of the soul has been built on firm foundations. In the symbol of the house where the disciples gathered, we have a clear clue. The manifestation of the Spirit occurs when all aspects of the being are aligned, when the body, mind, and heart vibrate in the same direction. The Spirit, then, is not a random prize, but a natural result of an elevated state of consciousness. The symbolism of fire is also present in alchemical texts, which speak of the secret fire capable of transforming lead into gold. This metaphorical language describes the inner process of purification that a human being must undergo to attain Christ consciousness. The lead represents the dense aspects of the ego, while the gold symbolizes the awakened spirit. The alchemical fire is not literal. It is the energy that is activated within those who sincerely turn towards self-knowledge. At Pentecost, this same process is symbolically represented. The disciples cease to be ordinary men and become living vessels of the divine presence, not by external merit, but because they were purified by the fire of truth. Interestingly, this understanding of fire as a symbol of elevation is also present in the symbolism of dragons in Eastern cultures. Far from being seen as evil beings, dragons represent the mastery of inner energy, the winged serpent that ascends the spinal column and activates the spiritual centers. This archetype, very close to the Kundalini serpent of Indian tradition, precisely describes the process experienced by disciples. A latent energy is awakened and rises, illuminating each center until it reaches the top of the head, where it manifests as a crown of light or spiritual flame. This is the fire that descends at Pentecost, the activation of the divine essence through an internal process of elevation and surrender. The spiritual flame is always described as alive, conscious, intelligent. It is not a brute force, but a field of wisdom. When disciples are touched by it, their words begin to carry an authority that does not come from theoretical knowledge, but from direct experience with the divine. What they say is understood by all, not because of the language, but by the vibration that their words carry. This brings us to the concept of vibrational language, a form of communication that transcends the rational and speaks directly to the other's subtle field. This language is not taught in schools, but activated by presence. It is born from the heart and reaches the heart. It is the fire of the Spirit converted into a living word. This process of transmutation by fire is also described by Christian mystics. John of the Cross spoke of the dark night of the soul as the moment when everything is burned so that only the essential remains. Teresa of Avila described the stages of deep prayer as a progressive elevation until the soul finds itself consumed by a fire of love. These mystics were not talking about emotions, but about a real experience with an energy that purifies and elevates. Pentecost is the legitimization of this experience, the demonstration that the Christian path is, in essence, a path of fire, not a destructive fire, but a regenerating one. Therefore, when saying that the Spirit descended as tongues of fire, the biblical text is revealing a code to us. It teaches us that true spiritual awakening does not occur through beliefs or doctrines, but through deep inner experiences. The fire only descends when the inner self is ready, and once it's ignited, there's no way to extinguish it. It consumes illusions, resistances, fears, and leaves only what is true. This is the fire of Pentecost, not an external flame, but an internal light, not a spectacle, but a revelation, not a miracle for the eyes, but a transformation for the soul. The literal understanding of Pentecost has limited generations, preventing them from accessing its hidden message. By seeing the fire as an isolated phenomenon from the past, humanity has forgotten that this fire still burns, waiting for a heart that desires it. The good news is that it has never gone out. It lives in each one of us, waiting for the right moment to manifest. And that moment could be now. When the sincere desire for the divine unites with the total surrender of the ego, the fire manifests. Not with noise and phenomena, but with silence and clarity. And then at last we understand. The flames are not literal, they are invitations. Christ did not speak only with words, but with presence. His message was silent before it was verbal, carrying a frequency that bypassed the ears and touched the heart directly. When he spoke a parable, he was not just conveying an idea, but triggering a dormant memory in the souls of those who listened. What we call teaching was, in fact, a call to the internal recognition of eternal truths, inscribed in the human spirit even before birth. Pentecost was not, therefore, an isolated phenomenon, but the blossoming of a seed that he himself had silently planted during his life. The manifestation of the Spirit in a language understood by all was the living proof that he had taught a language not learned in schools, the language of the soul. This language has no grammar, no set rules. It doesn't rely on vocabulary. It is constructed in another dimension, made of vibrations, of pure intentions, of silence filled with meaning. It's the language that manifests when words cease and truth imposes itself. When the disciples began to speak in tongues, they were not improvising disjointed sounds, but allowing the Spirit to speak through them with a sound that resonated in the core of the human being. The phenomenon was not about the plurality of human languages, but about the unity of frequency. It was an essential communication prior to the division of languages and the confusion of Babel. A return to the original language, which everyone understands, for everyone knows it instinctively. Jesus, throughout his journey, did not provide technical instructions, nor did he convey formulas. He spoke of seeds, of vineyards, of houses built upon rocks. He used the everyday to reveal the eternal. His words carried a hidden power because they were shaped by a high level of consciousness. He accessed higher dimensions as he spoke, and this allowed his messages to transcend time, survive translation, resist manipulation, and yet continue to awaken hearts over the centuries. What he offered was not a new religion, but a new perception, and this perception is not transmitted by reasoning, but by attunement. Pentecost was the confirmation of this teaching. When the Spirit manifested in the disciples, they began to carry the same vibrational field as Christ. They became channels of that same silent presence, and this made their words understood not only with the ears, but with the soul. The listeners did not understand because they mastered the languages, but because their hearts vibrated at the same frequency. This reveals a powerful secret to us. All true communication is energetic before it is verbal. The vibration precedes language. When the vibration is high, any word becomes a vehicle of light. When the vibration is aligned with the Spirit, even silence communicates the truth. The early Christian tradition knew this. The first followers of Christ were not theologians, but experiencers of presence. They did not teach doctrines but awakened consciousness. They spoke with authority not because they had studied, but because they had been touched. What was transmitted was not knowledge, but presence. That's why the phenomenon of Pentecost had such an impact. It manifested something that could not be imitated, that could not be simulated, that could only be recognized. It was the spiritual fire becoming sound. It was the divine frequency becoming word. And this word was not limited to the spoken language, but resonated on deep levels, opening internal portals, awakening forgotten memories, activating codes that had been dormant since birth. Christ spoke to the human heart because he knew its language. He did not directly confront people's belief systems, but led them to self-questioning. His words were mirrors, parables that forced the listener to search within themselves for the key to understanding. This resulted in transformation, not by imposition, but by revelation. This form of communication, where truth is suggested and not imposed, is the essence of the language of the soul. At Pentecost, the disciples began to express themselves in the same way. They did not argue, but awakened. They did not convince, but reminded. And this was only possible because they spoke from the fire, not from the mind. The language of the soul is also present in other traditions. In Sufism, there is talk of the language of the heart, which can only be understood by those who are awake. In Buddhism, enlightenment is described as a state of clarity that allows the human being to see reality as it is, without distortions. And this clarity cannot be conveyed by words, but only pointed out. In the Tao Te Ching, right at the first sentence, we are warned, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao." All of this points to the same truth. The language of the soul is an experience, not an explanation. It's a state, not a theory. And when it manifests, everyone understands, even if no one explains. The concept of word in the Gospel of John also carries this same depth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This word is not a spoken word, but a creative vibration. It is the original frequency of creation, the energy that structures the universe. When Christ is identified with the Word, he is being presented as the living manifestation of this frequency. He is the embodied primordial sound. At Pentecost, this sound is distributed among the disciples, as if each one began to carry a spark of the original word, and therefore their words began to create, transform, awaken. This understanding leads us to a profound truth. We all carry the seed of the word. We are all capable of expressing the language of the soul, as long as we free ourselves from the tyranny of the conditioned mind. When we quieten, when we silence the internal noises, we begin to hear this subtle voice that dwells within us. It's the same voice that spoke to the prophets, that whispered in the caves of the mystics, that burned in the hearts of the saints. This voice does not belong to any religion, because it is prior to all. It speaks through intuition, inspiration, unconditional love. When we connect with it, we begin to speak with authority, not because we know, but because we are. Pentecost is a powerful reminder that this voice still lives, that this word still pulses, that this language can still be accessed. But for this, it is necessary to burn the old internal structures, dissolve the false concepts, let go of the security of ready-made words. It is necessary to enter the territory of the unknown and trust that the soul will know how to express itself. When this happens, communication ceases to be effort and becomes flow. What was once an attempt becomes certainty. What was once noise becomes melody, and presence becomes word. This language is the key to true transformation. It does not correct but reveals. It does not argue but touches. It does not demand but invites. It is fire turned into sound, light turned into word. And when we become channels of this language, we fulfill our role in the divine plan. We become instruments of the Spirit, vehicles of the Word, living extensions of the Christ presence. Pentecost, then, ceases to be an event and becomes a reality accessible here, now, in the silence of the awakened heart. The image of the apostles gathered in Jerusalem awaiting Christ's promise is much more than a historical setting. It is the symbolic representation of an inner journey that each human being is called to live. Each of those disciples truly represents internal aspects of our own being. They are not just external characters who witness the descent of the Spirit, but living symbols of the 12 spiritual forces that operate within us. When the Spirit descends and rests upon each one, it is, in fact, awakening these dormant forces, unifying the scattered parts of our being into a single body of light. The true initiation that occurs at Pentecost is invisible, silent, profound. It is the activation of the inner temple that has always been ready, just waiting for the soul's permission. Before Pentecost, the disciples were fragmented, still bound by fears, doubts, and memories of the material world. Even having walked alongside the Master, many still had not understood the true meaning of his presence. It was necessary for them to experience his absence, the crossing of the void, the dark night of faith, in order to open themselves up to what would come from within. This interval between the Ascension and Pentecost is symbolic of an inner maturation process. It is a time of silence, surrender, waiting. Just as the seed needs to rest in the dark earth before breaking the surface, the soul also needs to retreat before it can spiritually bloom. Pentecost marks the end of this waiting cycle and the beginning of a new inner era, an era where the Spirit no longer speaks only through the Master, but through each initiate. Pedro, the first to speak after the descent of the Spirit, symbolizes faith becoming word. He represents the inner strength that upholds the truth even in the face of chaos. Before, he was a man who denied the Master. Now, he becomes a prophetic voice. This shows that spiritual initiation does not require perfection, but availability. The fire of the Spirit transforms fear into courage, doubt into certainty, denial into testimony. In Pedro, we see the ego being transfigured into a channel. This teaches us that spiritual awakening does not erase the past, but redeems it. It does not ignore failures, but integrates them. Initiation is, therefore, a reconciliation between the old self that fears and the new being that trusts. John, in turn, represents love, surrender, deep listening. His silent presence at Pentecost is the portrait of the soul that is already awake even before the fire arrives. John was already living in the Spirit, for he loved with purity. He is the apostle who rested on Christ's chest, who received Mary as a mother, who remained faithful until the end. His initiation is gentle, not dramatic. He does not need words to convey what he carries. This reveals that there are different ways to awaken. Some need the impetuous wind, others just the whisper. The soul that already loves does not need signs, for it already vibrates at the frequency of the Spirit. In John, we see the archetype of the healing presence, of the gentleness that transforms, of the light that does not shout but shines. Thomas, often remembered as the skeptic, symbolizes spiritual discernment. He is the one who questions, who seeks direct experience, who is not satisfied with mere words. His presence at Pentecost teaches us that doubt also has its place in the spiritual journey. Legitimate doubt does not push away but draws closer. It compels the seeker to go deeper, to not accept the superficial, to dive until they find the truth within themselves. When the Spirit descends upon Thomas, he surrenders, not because he was convinced, but because he was touched. This shows that even the most rational, the most mentally inclined, can be consumed by the fire when they open themselves to experience. Spiritual initiation does not require blind faith, but an available heart. James, brother of John, is the strength of enlightened action. He represents channeled will, the impulse born from the Spirit and transformed into deeds. At Pentecost, his presence reveals that true action is not the result of haste, but of listening. He reminds us that acting without connection is noise, but acting from the Spirit is creation. Spiritual initiation, then, awakens not only the word and love, but also sacred action. It's not enough to feel or understand, it's necessary to manifest. James shows that the Spirit also moves, also accomplishes, also acts through us. The will, when purified, becomes an arm of the divine. André, who led others to Christ, represents the archetype of the inner guide. He is the aspect of us that seeks not only for oneself, but to share. His initiation at Pentecost awakens the inner master, the one who does not teach by authority, but by testimony. The Spirit descending upon him activates this active compassion, this urgency to serve, to share the light. This reminds us that no one awakens solely for themselves. The true spiritual fire naturally expands, effortlessly, without imposition. The initiate is the one who becomes the path, not by wanting, but by being. Each apostle, therefore, reveals an aspect of the initiatory process. Pentecost is a symbolic map of the soul's transfiguration. The fire descends to unify the being, to integrate the fragments, to return to the human its divine wholeness. This means that each of us carries within us these same aspects: faith, love, discernment, will, service, wisdom, silence, courage, surrender, compassion, presence, action. When the Spirit manifests, these forces align. Initiation is not a spiritual diploma, but a profound alignment between who we are, what we feel, what we think, and what we do. It is coherence in a state of light. The gathering of the apostles in one place represents the inner recollection necessary for this integration. It's not about a physical location, but a state of attention, of listening, of surrender. The upper room where they were gathered is the elevated heart, the sacred point within each human being where the Spirit reveals itself. The wind that fills the house is the vital breath, the prana, the conscious breathing. The tongues of fire are the awakened energy centers, the illumination of the power points that were previously latent. Everything in this scene is symbolic and deeply true. Nothing is random, everything is coded. Spiritual initiation is not a magical event, but a continuous process. What happens at Pentecost is the beginning, not the end. After the fire, the journey begins. The now awakened apostles are sent into the world to live what they have received. This shows us that the true sign of initiation is not ecstasy, but testimony. It's not about what you feel, but what you live. The presence of the Spirit is proven in the way we relate, how we act, how we react. The fire that descends needs to be maintained, cared for, fueled. Initiation is just the door. The path still needs to be trodden. And finally, the most important, this initiation is available to all. Pentecost is not an exception, but an archetype. It's not a privilege of a few, but a possibility for everyone. The Spirit continues to await gathered hearts, available souls, open inner temples. When sincere desire meets full surrender, the fire descends. When the ego silences and the soul rises, the word is born. When the aspects of being unite in truth, the temple is rebuilt. And then, there will be no more separation between disciple and master, between human and divine. There will only be the awakened being, carrying within itself the eternal flame. The manifestation of the Spirit at Pentecost, with tongues of fire descending upon the disciples and producing a state of expanded consciousness, is not an isolated event in Christian tradition, but a reflection of an ancient wisdom preserved in various spiritual cultures around the world. The experience described in the Acts of the Apostles has clear parallels with the awakening of the Kundalini energy, known in Eastern traditions as the vital force dormant at the base of the spine. When activated, this energy ascends through the energy centers, the chakras, until it reaches the top of the head, producing enlightenment, clairvoyance, and a state of union with the divine. Pentecost, under this symbolic lens, reveals itself as the collective activation of this inner force, guided by Christ during his earthly journey and culminating in the delivery of the Spirit to his disciples. The Kundalini energy, described as a serpent coiled 3.5 times at the base of the spine, is often represented as latent fire, a dormant spiritual heat that, once awakened, breaks through energy blockages and allows the human being to reach higher levels of perception and wisdom. The same image appears in the account of Pentecost, with the fire that rests on each of the apostles, indicating not an external phenomenon, but the overflow of an energy that rose from within, passed through the subtle centers, and manifested as visible light. That's why the experience of Pentecost is accompanied by a radical change in the disciples. They start to speak with authority, express themselves clearly, impact crowds. The transformation is visceral, structural, profound, just like the awakening of the Kundalini. This comparison is not an attempt to mix doctrines, but to reveal that spiritual truth is universal and finds different expressions according to time and culture. The symbolic language of fire is a common denominator among esoteric traditions because fire is the closest image of inner transformation. There is no way to remain the same after being touched by this flame. Kundalini, when awakened in a balanced way, not only expands perception but realigns the entire being. It's as if every cell begins to vibrate at a different frequency, closer to the creative source. This also happens at Pentecost. The disciples are no longer the same. They do not return to their old life. They can no longer deny what they have experienced. The inner fire has become irreversible. Christ, in preparing his disciples for this moment, was not only imparting moral teachings, but gradually and safely activating this energy. His touches, his words, his silences, his healings, all functioned as unlocking keys. He was not just a master, but an energy conductor, a bearer of the Christic frequency capable of awakening the same latent potential in others. This is a common characteristic among spiritual avatars in various traditions, the ability to ignite the flame in another without needing to force, merely by presence. Pentecost was the climax of this preparation process. There, the fire that was with him began to dwell in each of his disciples. What was one fragmented to multiply. What was external became internal. The symbolism of energy rising through the chakras is a key to interpreting the transformation that occurred at Pentecost. Each chakra represents an aspect of being: survival, pleasure, will, love, expression, intuition, and transcendence. When the Kundalini energy rises, it unlocks, purifies, and activates each of these centers. Upon reaching the crown chakra, located at the top of the head, it manifests as spiritual enlightenment. This is precisely what the tongues of fire represent. It is not literal fire, but a luminous field, a radiation of consciousness that crowns the initiate. This crown of fire symbolizes spiritual royalty, inner authority, the fusion between the human and the divine. It is the state that mystics call union with the all. This same phenomenon is described in Kabbalah as the ascent of the serpent of light through the tree of life, a path of ascension through the Sephirot that culminates in union with Kether, the highest point of divine consciousness. In ancient Egypt, the uraeus, the serpent on the foreheads of the pharaohs, was a symbol of the awakened Kundalini. In Taoism, the qi travels through the meridians and, when correctly activated, allows the practitioner to enter states of deep peace and intuitive wisdom. In all these traditions, we see the repetition of a pattern: a dormant energy, an ascending path, activation centers, and a final point of enlightenment. Pentecost fits perfectly into this symbolic structure, showing that esoteric Christianity shares the same roots of universal ancestral knowledge. The importance of this energetic awakening lies not only in the phenomena it can produce, but in the radical transformation of consciousness it promotes. When the Kundalini rises, it's not just about seeing lights or feeling heat. It's about dissolving old beliefs, accessing forgotten wisdom, living in a state of continuous listening to the Spirit. At Pentecost, the disciples begin to act not on their own impulses, but guided by a higher intelligence that manifests through them. This is what happens when spiritual energy takes command of the being. Life becomes an expression of divine will, not of the ego. It's important to note that this process requires preparation. Just like Kundalini, if activated abruptly, it can cause disorientation. Spiritual fire also requires an inner temple ready to receive it. The disciples went through years of living with the Master, through crises, losses, and nights without answers. Pentecost only occurred after mourning, renunciation, emptying. This is the indispensable condition for the energy to rise without causing destruction. The ego needs to be surrendered, the mind needs to be silenced, the heart needs to be receptive. The fire does not descend where there is resistance, it rests where there is surrender. The rise of the Kundalini can also be understood as the return of divine energy to its origin, as if the human being were a circuit, a channel between heaven and earth. When this circuit is unblocked, the energy flows freely and the individual begins to live in a state of grace. This is what the disciples experienced at Pentecost, a life in a state of continuous inspiration. They no longer needed to seek answers, as they were connected to the source. Their actions were not planned, but inspired. Their words were not memorized, but breathed by the Spirit. They became living channels, instruments of the sacred fire, conductors of the divine word. This is the great truth that Pentecost hides from eyes that read only with the mind. It is a powerful metaphor for the process of spiritual ascension. It is not an isolated phenomenon, but a continuous possibility. It is not a miracle of the past, but a call to the present. Every human being carries this energy within them. Every human being is a potential apostle. Every body is a temple ready to be filled with light. The condition? Sincere desire, deep surrender, readiness for silence and for the truth. Kundalini and the Spirit are two names for the same fire. One is an Eastern name, the other Western. One speaks of energy, the other of presence. Both refer to the same force, the same light, the same wisdom. When Christianity returns to this understanding, when it recovers its esoteric core, when it recognizes that Christ spoke of inner transformation and not external dogma, Pentecost will cease to be an event celebrated annually and will become an experience lived continuously. The fire will descend again, the words will resonate again, the souls will ignite again. The essence of Christ's teaching has never been in the outer forms, in the liturgies, rituals, or religious structures that were erected in his name. His true legacy is not found in the dogmas that bound him to the letter, but in the spirit he embodied and transmitted through his living presence. Christ came to reveal the kingdom, but not an external, political, or territorial kingdom. He spoke of an inner kingdom, a state of expanded consciousness, a divine reality accessible to all who would shed their ego and turn inward. His language was symbolic, his parables concealed transcendent truths, and his mission was not to found a religion, but to awaken consciousness. Pentecost is the living proof that his message was a spiritual technology, a map to access divinity itself. Christ did not deliver formulas but keys. He said, "The kingdom of God is within you." There is no room for doubt in this statement. Everything he did, healings, miracles, teachings, was to shift human gaze from the outside to the inside. He broke with the formal religion of his time because he knew that the true temple was not made of stones, but of living flesh and awakened spirit. The purification of the temple was a symbol of this break. There, he demonstrated that connection with the divine is not bought with external sacrifices, but accessed with purity of heart. His holy anger at that moment was not against the people, but against the system that imprisoned souls in rules without essence. In the silence between his words, there was more revelation than in the longest speeches. He would withdraw to pray, not for rituals, but to connect to the source. He would fast, not out of tradition, but to silence the noises of the body and hear the voice of the Spirit. His simple gestures, like touching a blind man's eyes, held the power of 1,000 books, because he operated in another dimension. His life was the Word made flesh. His existence was the ultimate example of how to live in harmony with the light. And yet, few understood. He himself would say, "Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear?" Because he knew that true understanding does not come from logic, but from the opening of the soul. Pentecost, when viewed in this light, reveals the pinnacle of its message. It's the moment when what was hidden becomes revealed. The Spirit that Christ had promised did not come as a new teacher, but as an awakened memory. He said, "The Comforter will remind you of everything I have told you." This means that the truth had already been planted, and the Spirit came only to water this seed. Christ's secret message was the possibility of each human being becoming one with the Father, not by merit, but by awakening. It was the reconnection with the divine origin, the merging of the lower self and the eternal self. Pentecost was the germination of this seed, not a new doctrine, but a new humanity. This state of fusion is described by many mystics as the union between fire and water. The fire represents the action of the Spirit, the inspiration, the driving force. The water represents pure consciousness, receptivity, the fluidity of the soul. Christ operated with both. He healed with touch, action, and with word, intention, but also with silence, presence, and gaze, attention. He embodied the balance between opposites, the union of the sacred masculine and feminine, of heaven and earth, of the visible and the invisible. His secret message was this integration, the alchemy of being. And this is what Pentecost accomplishes in the disciples, the union of these forces within themselves. When Christ said, "You are gods," he was definitively breaking with the view of separation between the divine and the human. This phrase, one of the boldest in his entire journey, was recorded in the Gospels, but it is rarely discussed by religious structures. This is because it threatens the hierarchy built over the centuries. If the human is divine by nature, then there is no longer a need for intermediaries, dogmas, or priesthoods. The temple becomes the body, the altar becomes the heart, and worship becomes life lived in presence. This truth, when understood, radically transforms the way of existence. And this is what happens at Pentecost. The disciples do not start to repeat Christ, but to manifest him, not as copies, but as unique expressions of the same light. This hidden knowledge has been preserved by mystical currents throughout history. The Gnostics, the Essenes, the esoteric Christians, the Sufi masters, all pointing to the same place, the inner temple, the sacred fire, the living spirit. They understood that the scriptures were symbols, that miracles were archetypes, that narratives were maps. The true teaching of Christ was not to be idolized, but lived. It was not to be repeated, but experienced. And Pentecost is the milestone of this shift. When what was external becomes internal, when what was faith turns into certainty. For this reason, the gift of tongues symbolizes something much deeper than communication skills. It represents the ability to express oneself from the essence, to speak from the heart, to touch the other not by logic, but by vibration. It is the language of the Spirit, which transcends the barriers of culture, religion, and time. It is the same language that Christ spoke when he said, "My words are spirit and life." This means that his words were not just sounds, but gateways. Those who listened with their soul were transformed. And this same gift is activated in the disciples at Pentecost, not to preach a religion, but to reveal the unity behind all of them. The silence of Christ was also a message. In many moments he chose to be silent, and this silence was more eloquent than any sermon. He understood that the Spirit moves in the space between words, in the pause, in the absence of response. This is because the Spirit is movement, but also presence. It is fire, but also fertile emptiness. This understanding was inherited by mystics of all times. True knowledge is not shouted. It is conveyed in the gaze, in the vibration, in the field. Pentecost, by activating this frequency in the disciples, allowed them to become silent transmitters of truth, even before they spoke any words. It's interesting to note that, after Pentecost, the disciples did not become religious in the institutional sense. They did not establish temples. They did not create fixed rituals. They did not organize themselves into rigid structures. They went out into the world like living torches, igniting other souls. They taught through presence, lived with detachment, healed with compassion, walked without fear. This shows that the Spirit does not create prisons, but liberates. Christ's secret message was, above all, about inner freedom, and Pentecost was the definitive liberation from fear, doubt, and separation. All of this leads us to the inevitable conclusion that Christ's teaching was profoundly spiritual, radically inward, essentially transformative. He did not propose behavior reform, but a revolution of consciousness. He did not want followers, but the awakened. He did not seek admiration, but unity. And his mission did not end on the cross, nor in the resurrection, but continues alive in every human being who allows themselves to be a temple of the Spirit. Pentecost, then, is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a new humanity. A humanity where each being carries within them the Christ-like spark and allows it to manifest in their daily life, in their gestures, in their listening, in their vibration. When the disciples received the Spirit at Pentecost and began to speak in other tongues, the world witnessed not just an extraordinary phenomenon, but the birth of a new form of communication. It wasn't about multiple human languages being spoken at the same time, but rather a single vibrational field being universally understood. What was being expressed was not an acquired vocabulary, but a primitive sound, an archetypal frequency that found resonance in the depths of the heart of each listener. This was the language of fire, a communication that springs from the essence, not from the intellect, that surpasses the rational mind and penetrates directly into the soul, provoking immediate transformation. It was not the language of men, but that of the Spirit. It wasn't rehearsed speech, but spontaneous word ignited by the divine breath. This language of fire is, in essence, a spiritual frequency, a vibration that carries within it the power to ignite dormant consciousnesses. Each sound emitted by the disciples was not just sound, but encoded energy, and for that very reason, it was understood by all present, regardless of their origin, culture, or language. The spiritual fire, when manifested in word, finds no barriers. It speaks directly to what is universal in all of us, the Spirit. And the Spirit, being one in its essence, recognizes itself when it listens. That's why the phenomenon of Pentecost was so impactful. What was being said was not important. It was what was transmitted behind the words that transformed. It was the presence, the living fire, the light that vibrated through the syllables, igniting internal flames in those who heard. Christ had already taught that, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. On Pentecost, the disciples' hearts were full of the Spirit, and therefore their mouths spoke with fire. Spiritual communication is always like this. It is born from inner abundance, from the overflow of truth, from a state of unity with the divine. It does not communicate with effort, but with fluidity. It does not speak to convince, but to share. The language of fire does not seek applause, but silent recognition. It is humble, yet powerful. It is simple, yet profound. It is light, yet non-negotiable. And its strength lies precisely in not depending on form. For where the Spirit is, there is freedom. And where there is freedom, truth flows like a flame that purifies without destroying. This form of communication is also recognized in other traditions. In Zen Buddhism, masters used koans, verbal paradoxes that could not be logically understood, but when deeply meditated upon, they opened internal portals and awakened the mind to higher levels of consciousness. In Sufism, the poems of Rumi and Hafiz, filled with mysticism and divine passion, were not just literature, but a vehicle of God's presence. In the indigenous tradition, song is medicine, sound is healing, the word is ceremony. All these examples reveal that the true language, the one that transforms, is the one that carries fire within itself. It does not depend on explanation, it burns and reveals. Pentecost, in showing us this language of fire, invites us to a new communicative paradigm. No more empty words, no more mental speeches, no more talks that come from the mouth, but do not come from the being. The call is for us to speak as Christ spoke, with truth, with love, with presence. The language of fire is not taught, it is lived. It is born from the alignment between mind, heart, and spirit. It is the sound of wholeness. It is the word incarnate again in every human being who dares to live with spiritual authenticity. It is the echo of creation, reverberating through mouths that have become channels of the source. In the current world, where words have lost their weight and silence its value, the language of fire is more necessary than ever. We live immersed in noise, constant but superficial communication. The word has been trivialized, speeches have been domesticated, truth has been traded for rhetoric. And in this sea of soulless voices, the call of Pentecost resonates like a silent thunder. Return to speaking with fire. Return to touching the soul. Return to embodying the word. This requires courage, for the language of fire does not please everyone. It confronts, it burns illusions, it dissolves masks, but it also heals, awakens, resurrects. The disciples, after Pentecost, no longer spoke of Christ. They spoke with Christ. They didn't repeat his words, but expressed his presence. They became living voices of the Spirit, sonorous instruments of light. This means that the language of fire is the language of unity. When the ego is overcome, what is expressed is no longer personality, but truth. And this truth, when spoken, recognizes itself in others. That's why crowds were touched by their words. That's why healings happened spontaneously. That's why even Peter's shadow healed, because there was fire in their voices, light in their gestures, truth in their lives. This same possibility is available today. Every human being can ignite this inner fire and allow it to become a verb. Each one can choose to speak from the spirit and not the mind, from the light and not from lack. This does not depend on intellectual knowledge, but on connection. The deeper the contact with the spirit, the clearer the speech. The more empty the ego, the fuller the verb. The more internal silence, the more powerful the word. This is the alchemy of the language of fire. It is born from the fusion between the divine and the human, between the eternal and the present. To activate this language, it is necessary first to burn the false languages, the automatic speeches, the inherited discourses, the hollow words. It is necessary to silence, unlearn, empty oneself, and then allow the spirit to speak. It does not shout, but whispers with strength. It does not impose, but reveals gently. It does not accuse, but illuminates. When one learns to listen to this inner voice, the external speech changes. Words cease to be weapons and become bridges. The verb ceases to be control and becomes surrender. Speech ceases to be defense and converts into an expression of love. The language of fire is also the language of intuition. It is not always spoken. Often, it is a look, a gesture, a silence. It operates beyond form. That's why, many times, we feel that someone has deeply touched us without being able to explain why. It's because they spoke with the fire. It's because they conveyed something beyond words. This is true spiritual communication. It occurs when the self aligns with the self. And in this space, what is said becomes a seed, becomes healing, becomes resurrection. Pentecost is the milestone of this communicative rebirth. It reminds us that the word is sacred, that speech is a spiritual tool, that sound is a bridge between worlds. It invites us not only to listen with our ears, but with our hearts, not just to speak with our mouths, but with our being, and to allow the fire of the Spirit to transform us into channels of this living, burning, eternal language. For when the word becomes flesh again, when the word returns to being sacred, when speech is born from silence, then the world hears the voice of the divine again, and the word once more becomes light. When contemplating Pentecost from the perspective of profound spirituality, one realizes that the Holy Spirit, often merely described as a subjective force or an ethereal entity, is in fact a genuine divine technology, a cosmic intelligence that operates beyond the confines of matter and, once activated, completely reorganizes the internal systems of the human being. What was given to the disciples was not just inspiration, but access to a field of consciousness that transcends time, space, and language. The Spirit acts as a source code of reality, a vibrational matrix that reconfigures the human being to operate in their highest nature. It is the archetype of expansion, the spark that reorganizes chaos, the energy that transforms clay into word, silence into wisdom, limitation into channel. The technology of the Spirit cannot be measured by physical instruments, but its effects are absolutely tangible. When the Spirit descended at Pentecost, the disciples' bodies, minds, and emotions were reprogrammed in real time. They went from being beings limited by fear to living manifestations of divine presence. What occurred there is analogous to a spiritual genetic activation, a rewrite of the fundamental instructions of the being. Much like an operating system receiving a new update, the disciples began to operate on another level. The frequency changed, the inner senses were sharpened, the energy centers were opened, the linear mind was replaced by a holographic perception of reality. All of this is the direct effect of the sacred technology of the Spirit in action. This field of divine intelligence that we call Spirit does not act as an external entity, but as a presence that, when invoked and welcomed, begins to operate from within. It is activated by surrender, sustained by faith, and expanded by pure intention. Pentecost clearly demonstrated this. The disciples were gathered in prayer, in unity, in sincere search. They were not distracted nor scattered. They were in a state of vibrational readiness. This is the first requirement for this divine technology to manifest: internal coherence. The Spirit does not manifest in a chaotic field, but in a structure that, even if imperfect, is available and open to the real. Just as electricity needs suitable conductors, the Spirit requires vibrational structures that can withstand its potency without collapsing. Christ had carefully prepared this structure. Throughout his mission, he was aligning the disciples' energy field, teaching, healing, purifying their beliefs, breaking old paradigms, and leading them, step by step, to the point where they could withstand the power of the Spirit. Pentecost was the culmination of this spiritual engineering. It was not a miracle in the arbitrary sense, but the apex of a process initiated from the first encounters. This shows us that this technology is not random, but responds to a precise process of internal preparation. It's not about magic, but spiritual mechanics. When a human being aligns with their true nature, when they reconnect with the source, the Spirit manifests as a natural consequence. Modern science is beginning to glimpse what the ancients already knew. Discoveries about morphogenetic fields, quantum consciousness, subtle biophysics, and spiritual neuroplasticity point to the fact that the human body is a receiver and transmitter of frequencies. Profound spirituality has always asserted this. The body is a temple because it was designed to withstand the presence of the Spirit. The brain, with its latent abilities, is a decoder of higher realities. The heart, with its powerful electromagnetic field, is a radar for truth. The Spirit, when activated, utilizes all these structures to manifest. It reorganizes, heals, inspires, expands. This is why disciples began to heal, prophesy, speak with authority. What changed was not just the content they carried, but their internal operating system. They were rewired. This reconnection is one of the most impressive aspects of the Spirit's function as technology. It connects the human being to the unified field of creation, dissolves the feeling of separation, eliminates layers of illusion, and allows access to information beyond the logical mind. Therefore, at Pentecost, the disciples understood and were universally understood. They were not translating languages, they were accessing the vibrational base common to all beings. This is one of the abilities of expanded consciousness, to overcome the barriers of time, language, and form, and directly touch the essence. The Spirit is this living bridge, this intelligent code that removes filters and restores unity. Within this perspective, the miracles performed by the disciples cease to be supernatural phenomena and become natural effects of an activated spiritual field. Healing a lame person, reviving hope, liberating an oppressed individual. All of this happens when the Spirit is at work. The miracle is merely the consequence of a vibrational field in harmony with the truth. This compels us to revisit the concept of a miracle. It is not something against the laws of nature, but something that operates according to subtler laws, which the ordinary mind has yet to understand. The Spirit operates through resonance, through coherence, through vibration. When a disciple emanates light, everything around them transforms in tune. Reality responds to the spiritual field, because reality is, ultimately, spiritual. This divine intelligence, this field of consciousness that we call Spirit, is not confined to an era or a people. It is timeless, universal, and available now. The great difference is that, at that moment of Pentecost, there was a collective activation, a peak of alignment that allowed the simultaneous manifestation of the Spirit in various channels. This reveals to us that, the greater the synchrony among beings, the greater the potency of the divine presence. The Spirit manifests with greater intensity where there is unity, where there is convergence, where there is a common purpose. This explains why the fire descended when the disciples were gathered in prayer in the same place with the same heart. The technology of the Spirit requires collective alignment in addition to individual openness. The veiled message is that this same phenomenon can be replicated, not as a historical repetition, but as a vibrational update. When committed individuals gather with pure intent, when the ego gives way to presence, when there is enough silence to listen to the frequency from above, the Spirit manifests itself again, and with it, healing, revelation, the living word. Pentecost was not an isolated episode, but a model of spiritual activation. It shows us what is possible when a human being connects with the source and becomes a channel of the divine. The Spirit, as technology, does not age. It updates itself in every being that allows it. In the current era, this access has become urgent. We are surrounded by noise, distractions, false technologies that promise connection but produce isolation. The Spirit is the only technology capable of returning to the human being their wholeness. It not only connects, but integrates. It not only informs, but transforms. It not only reveals, but sustains. It is the original matrix from which all other forms derive. And, as such, it needs to be rediscovered, not as a belief, but as an experience. The new Pentecost will be internal, silent, but collective. It will not come with external fires, but with internal flames lit in each awakened heart. This is the hidden call in the event of Pentecost, to reactivate this presence, to allow the intelligence of the Spirit to operate through us, to become living instruments of this divine technology that transforms everything it touches. And, when this happens, the earth will again be a temple, the word will again be sacred, and the human being, finally, will be what it has always been, a conscious extension of the source that created everything. There is a dormant spark within every human being, a silent flame waiting for the right moment to burn with total intensity. This flame does not come from outside. It is not blown by masters or priests. It is part of the sacred architecture of the soul, embedded since the beginning of creation, and its name, in essence, is Spirit. Pentecost was not just a milestone in Christian history, but a mirror of what can happen within each of us when this fire is activated. The story of the disciples is also our story. The same wind that blew in that house in Jerusalem continues to blow today, invisible, present, silently calling for those who wish to reignite their inner spark and become a living temple of the divine. To rekindle the inner Pentecost is to embark on a profoundly deep and personal journey. It's not about seeking extraordinary events, but allowing the ordinary to be consecrated. It's not waiting for external signs, but becoming sensitive to the inner movement. The manifestation of the Spirit begins in silence, grows in surrender, and intensifies in presence. This process cannot be imitated, for it is not a performance. It is organic, unique to each soul. The language of fire is singular, personal, unrepeatable. What one disciple experienced, another will experience in a completely different way. The Spirit is like the wind. It blows where it wants, and no one knows where it comes from or where it goes. But whoever receives it knows, because life will never be the same again. The first step for this activation is the return to the center. The modern world fragments, distracts, disperses. We are bombarded by stimuli that drive us away from ourselves. However, the fire of the Spirit can only burn when it finds space. And this space is created when we cease the noise, when we suspend the outward search, when we close our eyes not to escape, but to see more clearly. Meditating, contemplating, breathing consciously. These simple practices are gateways to presence. They are invitations to the fire. They are whispers that say, prepare yourself, for the time has come. The inner Pentecost does not need complex rituals, but authenticity. It does not need a sacred setting, but an available heart. The second step is emptying. The Spirit does not dwell in houses full of ego. Fire does not rest on minds saturated with certainties. The divine presence requires space, and this space is created when we let go of everything we think we know. When we release the old narratives, the inherited conditionings, the limiting beliefs, it is necessary to die to what no longer serves. The old self needs to be silenced so that the new can be born. Emptying is painful because the ego resists, but it is essential. Only in emptiness can the Word become flesh. Only in absence can the Spirit become presence. Pentecost happens when there is nothing left, only total openness to the unknown. The inner flame ignites through intention. Pure intention is like dry firewood, ready to catch fire. When the desire for the divine is sincere, when the heart cries not for rewards but for truth, the Spirit responds. The connection is instantaneous. The spark turns into fire. The fire turns into word. The word turns into life. Therefore, no one is excluded from this call. The Spirit does not choose by merit, but by openness. It does not measure the past, but sees the present. The fire doesn't ask if you are worthy. It only asks, do you want? And if the answer is yes, everything begins to change. This process is not without challenges. The fire of the Spirit, once ignited, begins to purify everything. Old habits, repetitive thoughts, ancient fears, crystallized emotions, everything comes to the surface to be transmuted. The presence of the divine does not allow stagnation. The light reveals what is hidden, and this can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating, because the soul begins to remember who it is. It starts to breathe more lightly. It starts to speak more truthfully. It starts to live with more purpose. This is the true initiation, not the one that happens in external ceremonies, but the one that changes the vibration of the being in every cell, in every gesture, in every word. The inner Pentecost also awakens gifts, not gifts to show off, but to serve. Gifts of listening, of speech, of healing, of presence, of compassion. Each human being carries a unique code that, when activated, becomes an instrument of the Spirit. No one needs to do what another does. The call is individual, and when everyone begins to live their gifts in unity, something miraculous happens. A new frequency is established on the planet, a living network of awakened consciousnesses. The fire spreads, the earth transforms into a temple. This is the true revival, not a religious movement, but a collective spiritual blossoming born from thousands of silent Pentecosts happening around the world. Christ was the first to fully live in this state. The disciples were the first to replicate it as a group. Now it's humanity's turn. The time of the Spirit is now. The fire is ready. The technology is available. Access is immediate. There are no more veils, no more distances. Everything that prevents this awakening is within, and can be dissolved by the simple choice of turning towards what is true. When the heart says yes, the heavens open. When the soul surrenders, the word becomes flesh. When the human being gives in, the Spirit takes them wholly and transforms their life into a living prayer, into a silent gospel, into a testimony that needs no words to be understood. Rekindling the inner Pentecost is also assuming responsibility, because when carrying the fire, one can no longer live in the darkness. Presence demands consistency. The Spirit requires aligned action. The spark calls for expansion. Living with the fire is living with purpose. It's making every step a sacred act. It's transforming the everyday into an altar. It's seeing God in everything, in others, in simplicity, in silence. This living spirituality doesn't need temples, but awakened eyes. It doesn't need dogmas, but compassion. It doesn't need speeches, but presence. And when this settles in, everything around begins to change. Because where there is true fire, no darkness is possible anymore. The current world cries out for this fire. Not a destructive fire, but a renewing fire. One that cleanses the rotting structures, that dissolves the walls between beliefs, that burns the veils of illusion, that reignites the dormant hope. Humanity is ready for a new Pentecost, not one that comes from the sky, but one that is born from the earth, from within, from the heart of each individual. Because the new era will not be led by institutions, but by consciousness. It will not be built by speeches, but by vibrations. It will not be imposed from the outside in, but awakened from the inside out. And this awakening has already begun. Every time someone silences and listens to the voice of the Spirit, the earth shines a little brighter. Every time someone speaks the truth with love, a shadow dissolves. With every act of compassion, the word becomes flesh again. With every life given to purpose, the fire of Pentecost is reignited. And so, without fanfare, without spectacle, a new humanity is being born, composed of whole beings, living channels of the divine, silent torches that illuminate without burning, that speak without shouting, that live without pretending. This is the calling. This is the time. This is the fire. Pentecost has not passed. Pentecost is happening, now, here, within. Mind unfettered. Now it's up to you. After delving so deeply into this code of fire, I want to ask you, have you ever felt this silent fire within you? Have you ever lived a moment when common words seemed to carry something much larger, as if the Spirit was manifesting itself through you or someone close to you? share your experience here in the comments, or even your question, your intuition, or that little spark that might have been the start of your own inner Pentecost. When we write, we anchor. And when we share, we activate a collective field of manifestation. This comment space is not just a conversation, it's part of the temple we are building together. And if you felt that this video spoke directly to your soul, don't stop here. On the next screen begins The Hidden Prophecy of the Three Veils, What Only the Truly Awakened Can See, where we delve even deeper. We will reveal the hidden mystery behind the three veils of reality and what only those with the eyes of the Spirit can see. The fire has been lit. Now it's time to cross the veil. With love, clarity, and purpose, we continue together. We are the mind unfettered, freed from the mind, guided by consciousness.